Columbia is lost. There are no survivors.
Another American tragedy in space. The Space Shuttle Columbia breaks up over Texas. The lives of all 7 on board lost.
It's a truly difficult day for all of us.
Good evening, I'm Tom Brokaw at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, with a special edition of NBC Nightly News. Tonight, here where there has been so much triumph, tragedy. It is deathly still. This morning, they were preparing for the routine return of the Space Shuttle Columbia. As it streaked high over Texas, headed for Florida, Mission Control began to express some concern about a loss of sensor data, including temperature and tire pressure readings on the left side. The shuttle, with 7 on board, including 2 women and an Israeli Air Force hero, was traveling 18 times the speed of sound at more than 200,000 feet. It was completing a health and science mission when all the communication suddenly broke off. Then, in the skies high over Texas, a loud boom, a fireball, a catastrophic loss of all on board in a hellish explosion. Immediately, the questions: what could have caused the shuttle to disintegrate? The first time in the history of the U.S. space flight program that a terrible accident has happened on approach and landing. We're covering this tonight from all angles, from here at the Cape, from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, on the ground in East Texas and in Washington, where we begin now with NBC's Robert Hager.
Tom, tonight NASA says in the minutes before the shuttle was lost, it lost data from a series of sensors back here near the left wing. It's an area that could have been damaged back when the shuttle first lifted off, and some insulation came loose and banged up against the wing. They know that much. If it damaged heat tiles that protect the shuttle from searing heat all over its skin on re-entry, that could have been trouble. But first, the sequence of this shocking event.
3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff of Space Shuttle Columbia.
It had been a 16-day spaceflight for scientific experiments. 6 U.S. astronauts, including 2 women and 1 Israeli. Now, this morning, 8:08 Eastern Time, as planned, the crew is given the okay to come home.
Or go for the burn.
Okay, we copy. Go for the burn.
8:15 a.m. They're descending now toward Cape Canaveral, but still 39 miles high, traveling 12,500 miles an hour. And the shuttle's skin is heating to 3,000 degrees from friction as it enters the atmosphere. Suddenly, 8:53 a.m., the first hint of trouble. Sensors on the left wing go out one by one. They measure temperature and pressure on hydraulic pumps and the tires. 8:59, Mission Control calls on the radio.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last.
Roger.
The shuttle is now over central Texas, and this would be the last that's heard from it. 1 minute goes by, then this from a NASA commentator.
Columbia out of communications at present with Mission Control as it continues its course toward Florida.
More time passes, agonizing, while controllers frantically try to restore communication. 9:06 a.m.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Now, terrible news. Witnesses in Texas have heard deafening booms and seen flaming pieces of metal shooting through the blue sky. Some say it appeared to explode and break up. Many captured it on home video.
I live in a mobile home, and it shook. It was like boom. I mean, you know, and that's what I thought. Something blew up.
It looked like just the vapor clouds as the separate pieces were separating.
9:16 a.m. By now, the shuttle was supposed to have landed in Florida. NASA tells of a last desperate move.
Search and rescue teams have been mobilized to the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
But there is no hope. At 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the flag is lowered to half staff at the Kennedy Space Center. All 7 astronauts are lost. And through this long day, small pieces of wreckage are beginning to be found, strewn over a wide area of southeast Texas and even into Louisiana. This sad event comes 17 years and 4 days since another shuttle, the Challenger, blew up after liftoff. That investigation took more than 4 months and grounded the rest of the shuttle fleet for nearly 3 years. Already now, a high-level commission has been appointed to supervise this investigation. It'll be looking into the question of those heat tiles and many more possibilities that could have caused this tragedy. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight. Back here at Cape Canaveral at the Kennedy Space Center, Columbia's crew was just minutes away from wrapping up a 16-day science mission, research on the effects of space on astronaut health and science experiments in zero gravity. NBC's Kerry Sanders tonight with more on this very accomplished group of scientists in space.
The commander of the mission was Rick Husband, a 45-year-old Air Force colonel from Amarillo, Texas, who wanted to be an astronaut from age 4. The former test pilot got his dream 9 years ago. This was Husband's second shuttle mission. In an interview before his first in 1999, he said, even with 3,800 flight miles under his belt, you never take anything for granted.
Sometimes you get to the point where you think, let's see, did I look at that? Did I look at that? You know, so you kind of feel like you have to go through a lot of last-minute checking to make sure that you've got things fresh in your mind and that everything's ready to go.
Mission pilot William McCool was in the left seat in the cockpit. A 41-year-old father of 3 from Lubbock, Texas, a graduate of the Naval Academy. This was his first shuttle mission, and just last week from space, he spoke to his hometown TV station, addressing his former military colleagues as the U.S. prepares for war.
I feel like saying a prayer, basically, for them all and for the world as a whole, that we don't have to go to war.
Payload Commander Michael Anderson from Spokane, Washington, was one of 7 African-American astronauts. Since childhood, an avid science fiction fan who dreamed of flying. A lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, this was his second mission. His responsibilities included overseeing dozens of science experiments. Kalpana Chawla was born and raised in India. She hoped to design aircrafts, never imagining she'd become an astronaut.
Casey would always say that her retirement dream was to go be a bush pilot someplace.
David Brown, a captain in the U.S. Navy, was a pilot and a doctor, and was once a circus acrobat. He was 46 years old on his first space flight. His father today.
Well, I'm getting real teary about it, but he died doing what he wanted to do.
Laurel Clark was a Navy doctor who dove the depths of the ocean before exploring the heights of space. A 41-year-old mother of 1, Clark was on her first mission. She was upbeat this morning, hours before the scheduled landing.
We're getting ready for a big day up here. Had a great time on orbit and really excited to come back home.
Tonight, all of Israel is mourning its native son, the first person from that country to go into space, 48-year-old Ilan Ramon. He was married with 4 children. The 7 crew members of the Space Shuttle Columbia who were supposed to land here today included 5 men, 1 African-American, 1 Israeli, and 2 women, 1 an Indian American, a true cross-section of the United States and the world. Kerry Sanders, NBC News, Cape Canaveral, Florida.
Now, more on the investigation. NBC's Robert Bazell, who has followed the shuttle program from the beginning, is following the effort already well underway to find out how this might have happened.
Within minutes of losing contact with Columbia, officials in Mission Control took steps to preserve all the measurements of temperature, altitude, speed, and hundreds of other variables recorded during the shuttle's descent.
We will be poring over that data 24 hours a day for the foreseeable future.
Investigators caution against jumping to conclusions. But the biggest suspect now, that piece of insulation that hit the tiles on the left wing during liftoff. The tiles are critical for protecting against heat damage during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere.
If several of them somehow were dislodged, you worry about that hurricane force wind on re-entry ripping more and more tiles off, and then if that's the case, the heat could melt through the aluminum skin of the orbiter.
How will investigators know whether tiles failed? The biggest clues will come from those hundreds or thousands of pieces of debris strewn across parts of Texas. Investigators are not certain whether they will try to reassemble them all, as they did with the remains of TWA Flight 800, but they will examine every one.
We have to look at it in 2 different ways. Was there an in-flight breakup that resulted in an explosion of the aircraft, or was there an explosion that resulted in an in-flight breakup? There's 2 ways to look at it. The evidence, that is the parts that have been found, are going to be key to trying to determine what happened first.
While the investigation unfolds, the shuttle program remains on hold. Meanwhile, 3 people remain in orbit on the International Space Station. They had expected to come home on the shuttle. But NASA officials said today the three have enough supplies on board the space station to last through June. And if need be, they can be resupplied or go home with Russian rockets, while American officials try to figure out what happened to the shuttle. Robert Bazell, NBC News, New York.
Now let's go to East Texas, where pieces of Columbia's wreckage fell across the countryside this morning. NBC's Jim Cummins heard the tremendous sound from that accident, and he joins me now from Texas. Jim, what's the latest there?
Hi, Tom. This morning, my wife and I were sitting at our home in Dallas reading the newspaper when we heard and felt a loud explosion. It was like a sonic boom, and it rattled the walls of our house. My wife ran outside to see if something happened to one of the neighbors, and then we learned 20 minutes later on the Today Show that somewhere over Texas, NASA had lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. Several camera crews and I scrambled toward East Texas following reports that debris from the space shuttle was raining down over hundreds of square miles.
This was the largest piece that we found.
From Dallas to the Louisiana state line. One piece of debris is as big as a car door, others as small as a penny.
Hit right there, in the ground, a little divot, and bounced over. I thought my hot water heater had exploded it.
There were hundreds of reports of debris landing in the small city of Nacogdoches, Texas, population 30,000. Dozens of small pieces of the shuttle landed on neighborhoods and in backyards. The authorities passed along a warning from NASA for everybody to stay away from any debris they found because it could be contaminated with hazardous materials from the shuttle, like rocket propellant or even radioactive material.
Clearly, it's federal property and should not be taken, and that would not be an appropriate taking of that property.
It gets a little scary.
Teal Hamilton said he heard what sounded like an explosion and ran out to his front porch.
I thought somebody had an accident on the highway. It was so loud, you know. And I looked out and I saw the limbs shaking in the trees. I said, what's going on?
That big piece of metal come floating down.
Bonnie Kerr will never forget this day.
I heard a noise and it sounded like somebody jumped on top of my house walking around, somebody big.
The debris narrowly missed her.
I feel blessed that nothing hit my house, you know, and I'm thankful. But it's just scary that stuff takes place like this.
Fortunately, a National Guard unit was on maneuvers in the area and is helping with the cleanup. They are treating the area around every piece of debris like a crime scene. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC Jim Cummins tonight in Texas. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where they monitor all of this. Kelly, what's the latest from there?
Good evening, Tom. Here at the Johnson Space Center, competing emotions, raw grief, and a promise of determination to root out a cause for this first ever NASA disaster on re-entry. Now, this is what it looked like on National Weather Service radar. A red streak across the sky appearing to be the shuttle as it is breaking up. Another piece of data that may help guide investigators comes from the military. NBC News has learned that highly sensitive infrared technology, satellite imagery, detected what's known as a heat spike. Now, that technology is a DSP satellite first developed to detect Soviet missiles. Now, the structure of the investigation here is quite broad. Inside NASA, every shuttle team is assigned a what-if scenario, and that team is already deployed to try to find out what happened. Among the things they're doing, impounding all of the sensitive data from computers and so forth to try to analyze that. They are also planning for a collection site where they may put debris to further analyze whatever wreckage is found. On the outside of NASA, there is a special team known as a Mishap Investigation Board. They've already been set up from across the federal government and the military to take a look at what has happened. Now, one of the mission leaders here expressed apprehension today, saying that when you consider the wreckage in a debris field so vast as we've heard and subjected to heat so intense, perhaps as great as 3,000 degrees, will anything left behind be able to reveal significant information? They just don't know. And here, Tom, there are signs of just how personal this loss is. Outside the Johnson Space Center, a spontaneous memorial, the flowers and candles brought by people who just wanted to show some expression. And inside here, expressions from the mission leaders, near tears, not only talking about the pain of losing friends, but expressing the burden of wondering if there was something, anything they could have done in planning to prevent this. Tom?
Thanks so much, NBC's Kelly O'Donnell tonight. With so much going on in the world at the moment, including, of course, the possibility of the United States getting ready for an attack on Iraq, it was a blow from out of the blue for the president, who was at Camp David when he got the news about Columbia breaking up, the loss of life. NBC's David Gregory joins me now from the White House with more on this sad day for the president and the nation. David?
Tom, it fell to an emotional President Bush this afternoon in an address to the nation to confirm what had become painfully obvious by mid-morning. His words, quote, "The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors." By midday, the president's motorcade was quickly returning to the White House from Camp David, where just after 9 a.m. this morning, his chief of staff, Andy Card, told him the shuttle was lost. Just after 2 p.m., Mr. Bush addressed the nation.
This day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country.
Earlier, as the president ordered the flags above the White House and all federal buildings lowered to half-staff, he called the crew's family members gathered in a conference room at the Kennedy Space Center, saying at one point, quote, "I wish I was there to hug and cry and comfort you right now."
Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown.
The president named each crew member, names little known in the country before today, and praised them for their daring and idealism.
These astronauts knew the dangers, and they faced them willingly, knowing they had a high and noble purpose in life.
The president, who spoke to numerous world leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Sharon, expressed his commitment to NASA's mission.
Our journey into space will go on.
And in tribute to the astronauts, spoke of God.
The same creator who names the stars also knows the names of the 7 souls we mourn today. The crew of the Shuttle Columbia did not return safely to Earth, yet we can pray that all are safely home.
The president, who tried to reflect the nation's grief today, felt his own. Aides say after his phone call to the crew's relatives in Florida, the president walked out of the Oval Office into his private study to spend a few moments alone. Tom.
Thanks very much, NBC's David Gregory at the White House tonight. This country's space program has had spectacular success, of course. It now seems routine when things go well, but still, as we always know, it's inherently a risky business. Today was a stark reminder of that. NBC's Brian Williams joins me now from New York with more on that part of the story. Brian?
Tom, the American space program is a story of astounding, even towering successes. 144 manned space flights, and it has been forced to go on at times despite some rare, crippling, and wrenching disasters. The colossal failures of the early space program, embarrassing and spectacular as they were, all took place before NASA ever dared to put a man inside a capsule. It was after years of great success in both the Mercury and Gemini programs that NASA suffered its first genuine catastrophe. Before it was ever able to leave the ground, the 3-man Apollo moon launch program was staggered when a launch pad fire took the lives of Apollo 1 astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee. 3 years later, Apollo 13 had to call off its moon landing, the only failure in a long line of moon missions, all ending safely.
T-minus 10, 9, 8.
January 28, 1986, the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, is among the 7 on board. Her parents are there as a spectacular launch goes tragically wrong.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
President Ronald Reagan is called upon to comfort the grieving families and an entire nation watching in disbelief as the tragedy played out.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
And now it falls to another American president to do the very same thing. Joining us now from Washington, a veteran of America's space program, Captain Rick Houck, who commanded the first space shuttle to go up after the Challenger disaster. Captain, good evening and welcome. What is the dynamic that we will now see again that put you behind the stick of a flight knowing the last one had gone down?
Well, NASA had never lost any people in space before they had the terrible Apollo 1 fire, but you're faced with the fact that you know that you're in a very risky business, and butterflies in the stomach, heart racing at liftoff. You get into space, and that's a very benign, peaceful time frame, but then you come back for the landing, and at the time that this happened, they were strapped into their seats with the exhilaration of knowing they were coming home, and they were literally powerless to do anything about this.
What does this do in your mind to the prognosis for the shuttle program? And after the initial horrible sadness dies down, can any good come out of it?
Well, there's always good that can come out of anything like this, especially when you have so many talented people that are focused on the causes. And this cannot be the end of this shuttle or space program. We're too much of an adventurous nation to let that happen.
Captain Rick Houck, thank you for being with us in Washington tonight. Now back to Tom Brokaw at the Cape. Tom.
Thanks very much, Brian Williams, tonight. When word first came of what had happened, many of us wondered the same thing. Could this have been an act of terrorism? NBC Jim Miklaszewski joins us now from the Pentagon with more on all of that. Jim, what are they saying there?
Tom, NASA and military officials moved quickly to try to shoot down any theories that today's tragedy was an act of terrorism. At the very outset, NASA ruled out the possibility Columbia was brought down by terrorists.
At this time, we have no indication that the mishap was caused by anything or anyone on the ground.
U.S. military radars detected nothing in the air that could have hit Columbia. There's no anti-aircraft missiles in the world with the range and speed to have reached the Columbia shuttle. The longest surface-to-air missiles can only reach an altitude of 95,000 feet. Shoulder-fired missiles like the Stinger have a range of only 5 miles, far short of the Columbia's flight path.
It was moving at approximately 12,000 miles an hour at an altitude of 200,000 feet, and there literally is no surface-to-air missile made today that would have taken it down.
But what about a bomb on board? Highly unlikely. Since the terrorist attack on 9/11, NASA has had extraordinary security around all shuttle launches. Security was even tighter for this flight because one of the astronauts, Ilan Ramon, was Israeli. Now, the internet's already humming tonight with theories connecting Columbia to terrorism or even the standoff with Iraq. The conclusion here, this was nothing more than a tragic accident. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC Jim Miklaszewski at the Pentagon tonight. More reaction from around the world to this shuttle disaster on this day. At the Vatican, the Pope prayed for the 7 astronauts during Mass at St. Peter's. But in Iraq, the disaster is being called God's retribution on Americans. One Iraqi government employee said, quote, "We are happy that it broke up." In Israel tonight, there is overwhelming sorrow, as you might expect. This was supposed to be the day that a national hero, the first Israeli astronaut, returned to Earth. His accomplishment as a payload specialist overshadowing just for a moment the violence and instability that typify Israeli life these days. Instead, this. NBC's Tom Aspel is in Tel Aviv tonight.
He was Israel's first astronaut and a rare spark of hope and pride for a troubled nation. But tonight, Israel is mourning for Colonel Ilan Ramon.
The disaster really hit all of us right in the heart. And really is a very sad day today.
In an Israeli television studio, Ramon's 79-year-old father watched helplessly as controllers lost contact with his son's space shuttle. He was helped from the studio in shock. His wife and 4 young children were in these bleachers at Cape Canaveral, waiting to watch the landing. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon accepted condolences in a phone call from President Bush.
It's on these moments, these tragic moments, that the hearts of the American people and the hearts of the Israeli people are bonded together.
In a country that reveres its military heroes, Ramon was a standout. He was a fighter pilot in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. He piloted an F-16 that bombed an Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. His mother and grandmother were survivors of the Nazi death camps in World War II. On his shuttle flight, Ramon carried their pictures, along with a small Jewish prayer scroll kept safe by a young Jewish boy during the Holocaust. He was known as a dedicated family man who was constantly reassuring his children that his space mission was a safe one.
No, I'm not worried because, he's not worried, so why should I be worried?
Just weeks ago, Ramon told Israeli television the chances of something going wrong were less than 1%. and insisted that NASA was being extra careful about flight safety. Ramon viewed his spaceflight as an opportunity to help Israel and dedicated his mission to Jews all over the world. Tonight, he's mourned here as a hero who died serving his country. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Tel Aviv.
And India tonight is also devastated by the loss of a national heroine, the first Indian-born astronaut to fly on a U.S. space mission. People there had planned to celebrate the shuttle landing, but when word of the disaster came, they streamed out of their homes to offer prayers instead. 17 years and 4 days have passed since the country was devastated by the explosion of the Shuttle Challenger. Tonight, the familiar feeling of shock and loss, and it comes at a time when there's a possible war in the immediate future. Americans are already on edge. Here's NBC's Roger O'Neill.
From Maine to California, sea to shining sea, a nation grieves. Words of condolence.
I just feel so sorry for all the people involved and their families.
As the flag flew half-staff over the nation's capital, a father and son went to the nation's Air and Space Museum. Joshua Lawrence wanted to learn about those who reach for the stars.
I'm just shocked about what's happening.
They were risking their lives to better mankind.
Word of Columbia lost knocked the wind out of us. And like 17 years ago, when the Challenger shuttle launched, Columbia returning from space this morning had become routine. No big deal. Now, though, another tragic reminder of the risk of space, accepted by the astronauts, but so hard on families. Krista McAuliffe was to be the first teacher in space, her friends on today's tragedy.
But goodness, to hear this today brings it all back in the kind of tragic way we felt it 17 years ago.
At a permanent memorial to Krista in Concord, New Hampshire, where she taught, a young boy was thrilled to sit in a mock-up of the shuttle this morning. Learning only minutes later, a real shuttle had just blown up.
You dream about what your kids might do when they get older. We were pretending to be pilots, and then you come out here and, find out that a shuttle has crashed. It's just scary.
Kids always seem more interested, more attuned to space exploration, and Columbia's mission was no different. At the Shoshone Indian Reservation in Fort Hall, Idaho, 10 students had a science project aboard Columbia.
Made me feel kind of mad and kind of sad at the same time. But I was trying not to think about it, because if I think about that, then it'll probably tear me down for a while.
As word of the fate of Columbia spread, a nation divided over a pending war with Iraq seemed to lay down those arms and unite in its mourning. At one peace vigil in Orlando, a woman said, "We are all human beings. Our hearts and tears go to the families. We are all touched." Columbia launched from the Kennedy Space Center 16 days ago. Thousands were there this morning to watch its triumphant return. Instead, tears over an empty launch pad and a flag at half-staff. Roger O'Neill, NBC News, Atlanta.
Now, with your permission, some personal thoughts. Coming back here to the Kennedy Space Center is always an evocative experience for me. I was here in 1981 for the launch of the first shuttle. And then, of course, that triumphant day when John Glenn, a grandfather, went back into space. The Kennedy Space Center here in Florida remains an impressive place with the outsized American flag on the vehicle assembly building behind me tonight in muted light. No amount of time, however, has dulled the excitement of a shuttle lifting off from the pad nearby. April 1981, that first launch, the bold and daring way to carry humans beyond the bonds of Earth. January 1986, the risks of the explosion on takeoff of the Shuttle Challenger. Then today, February 1st, another reminder of the great risks of great enterprise, the great courage required, the sacrifice to expand the limits of our place and space, to expand our knowledge. 1,000 years from now, this will be a monument to all of that and more. Tonight, it is, however, a place of mourning and heartbreak. I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC Nightly News at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, and I'll see you tonight at 8 Eastern Time for a special report On this sad day in the American space program, the loss of the Columbia and the 7 lives on board.